Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Luke Russell. He's Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Sydney, Australia. His research explores moral philosophy and he has written about evil, forgiveness, virtue, and vice. And we're going to talk about his new book, Being Evil, a Philosophical Perspective. So, Dr. Russell, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me on the show, Ricardo.
It's my pleasure. Okay, so perhaps let's start with a basic question. What is evil?
Evil is a word that's often used in relation to moral extremity, in relation to extreme wrongdoing, perhaps the worst kind of wrongs that you can imagine, and perhaps the worst kind of people who you can imagine. But there is a big disagreement amongst philosophers as to whether the concept of evil is a useful moral concept or not. There's a disagreement as to whether anything in the real world really is evil, or whether we should say evil is some kind of fiction or some kind of illusion. Perhaps there are philosophers who think that we ought to just drop the concept altogether, say there's no such thing.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, what would be some of the pluses and minuses of having that concept or dropping it? Because I would imagine that if the philosophers that say you should drop it, they would have their reasons, and perhaps they think that having it brings some negative consequences.
That's right. There are a range of different arguments that philosophers have offered for dropping the concept of evil, for saying there's no such thing and we'd be better off without it. Now, some of those arguments, as you alluded to there, are arguments pointing to consequences of using the concept. So there are some philosophers who think if someone thinks in terms of evil, if they're using that concept in their moral thinking, that encourages them to demonize people who they disagree with, and it encourages them to write people off instead of engage and understand. So there are philosophers like Philip Cole who think that if you use the concept of evil, you're going to fall into these bad patterns of thought that will have bad consequences, that will have immoral consequences. But some of the philosophers who argue against the use of the concept of evil are putting forward a more traditional style of error theory that will be familiar to philosophically trained people. So all of us are error theorists about Santa Claus. We think people make some claims about Santa Claus. You know, we can describe who Santa is supposed to be. He's supposed to be someone who brings presents to children on Christmas Eve, flies around the world. Right, so we've got a clear conception of who Santa is supposed to be, and all of us, or at least all of us adults, think that really there is no Santa. There's no person in the world who answers to that description. So some of the philosophers who are skeptics about evil think that kind of story is true about evil. We know what evil is supposed to be, or we know, for example, what an evil person is supposed to be like, but they think no one in the actual world actually meets that description. So here we get into some really interesting conceptual disagreements amongst philosophers as to what the concept of evil is supposed to mean. Right? So is it the case that, as I have argued, the concept of evil is applicable to morally extreme actions, to extremely wrong actions, and there's no kind of supernatural or religious metaphysical baggage that goes along with that concept? It's just a way to pick out the most extreme moral wrongs. Or is it the case that if you're thinking in terms of evil, you're buying into, say, a supernaturalist worldview according to which there are evil spirits, or there is a figure such as Satan, an evil being who's trying to corrupt people and who is a malign supernatural influence on the world. Right? So obviously there are people who have that supernaturalist worldview, and a lot of them use the language of evil. But part of what I'm doing in my book is trying to defend a secular account of the concept of evil And one of the main arguments in favor of that kind of secular account is just noticing that a whole lot of people who are atheists or who are agnostics, who don't believe in that kind of realm of supernatural beings, nonetheless judge that certain actions are evil. So, for example, some of the Holocaust survivors who wrote about the Holocaust are atheists, and nonetheless they describe what happened in the Holocaust as evil. Right? So the challenge, I think, for philosophers is to try and, come up with an account of what evil is supposed to be that is a secular account that doesn't require you to buy into supernaturalist metaphysics, but explains, the difference between evil and ordinary wrongdoing, and also helps us to understand why there's disagreement. Why are some, intelligent and well-meaning people completely skeptical of the idea that anyone or anything is evil?
Hmm. But I mean, when it comes to evil, and let's go with your approach, when is an action evil? I mean, because probably we wouldn't consider a minor morally bad actions as evil, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think that's the way that contemporary thinkers, people who are engaged in moral disagreements these days, use the word evil. It sounds really jarring. It sounds odd to describe a minor wrong as evil. Now, one of the fascinating things that I discovered in researching the philosophy of evil is that if you go back in the English language, the history of the English language, and you look at the way that the word evil was used hundreds of years ago, it did not have connotations of extremity. Evil was just used as a synonym for the word bad. So anything that was bad could be described as evil, including, someone who wasn't eating well could be described as having an evil diet. A toothache could be described as an evil. All right, so this is very different to the way I think contemporary people argue about evil when, for example, they're debating whether a particular serial killer should be thought of as an evil person, or whether they're asking whether a terrorist action should be described as evil. Right? But they're not merely discussing the question of whether it's bad in some way. There's agreement that it's bad. So evil now, I think, has connotations of extremity. And different philosophers have offered a range of different attempts to describe the distinction between evil and ordinary wrongdoing. Most of them are attempts to capture the nature of that extremity, the distinctive extremity of evil.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, this description you make about how people think about evil, are you only referring to professional philosophers or also the general public?
I think most people in the general public think that evil has connotations of extremity, but there are some interesting contexts in which people might use that older meaning of the word evil just to refer to bad. So there's a common phrase in English, the lesser of two evils, which is used as a description when you've got to make a choice between two bad things. So you choose the lesser of two evils. That's the old-fashioned meaning of evil, right? So if you're in a bad restaurant and you've got to choose, between two distasteful things on the menu, you think, okay, I'll choose the lesser of two evils. But that's, I think, an archaic, old-fashioned use of the word evil. And the interesting philosophical disagreements and moral disagreements amongst non-philosophers that I'm trying to tap into relate to things like spree killings or terrorist attacks or serial killers or war crimes, where there's, on one side of the debate, people who think that we need to use the language of evil to properly describe what's going on. And on the other side, people who think, I agree that what's happened is bad and is terribly wrong, but there's something wrong with the concept of evil. They balk at the use of that term. So that's part of the challenge, to try and figure out, well, what would make people who are intelligent, well-informed people wary about using the concept of evil?
Right, and I also asked you that question because it came to my mind that maybe how we think about evil is influenced by our culture.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be true for all of our moral concepts and the moral beliefs that we have, the moral practices that we carry out, the things that we think are deserving of praise and reward, the things we think are deserving of punishment. All of those are going to be influenced by our culture. But of course, we're not slaves to our own cultures. There's a massive history of moral dissent from within a culture. Moral reformers look at the moral attitudes that they were raised to hold and they say, I think that moral attitude needs to be reformed and changed. So, of course, there's that kind of cultural influence. And anyone who's doing moral philosophy will be interested in cultural variations in beliefs about, which are the worst kind of wrongs. And potentially, in the context of this discussion, there might turn out to be interesting cultural differences in relation to the conception of evil. Right? So this is something that you'd have to do empirical research into. I haven't got the training to do that kind of research. But here's a hypothesis that could be tested. Right? It might be the case that people who have a particular kind of, say, Christian upbringing think of evil in a certain way that differs from the way that people who are raised in a non-religious culture think about evil. That might be the case. All right, so this is fascinating, work for sociologists and psychologists to do, to see if there's that kind of cultural variation going on. Now, when we're doing philosophy of evil, we're trying to figure out what does the concept of evil refer to? Is there such a thing as evil or not? We need to, I think, try and take in a pretty broad range of discussions of evil. And this is going to include discussions from, say, psychologists, theologians, journalists, other philosophers, right? All of these are domains in which people will, say, try and explain what went on or try and make extreme condemnation of extreme wrongdoing. So we want to take all of that as input and see if we can come up with a theory that fits best with all of that discussion of evil. You can't come up with a philosophical theory that fits with what everyone says about evil, because different people say incompatible things. So one of the hard tasks in doing philosophy is figuring out if you're going to diverge in your philosophical account from some, say, folk discussion or everyday discussion of the matter at hand. You need an explanation of why you're diverging, and you need to say, okay, so some ordinary people are going to use the concept in a slightly different way. And I think that's probably the case in relation to evil. Some people clearly think that evil refers exclusively to spiritual, non-physical beings. And, I think, you can decide, if you like, to say you're going to use the word evil exclusively to refer to those things. But that clearly is not what's going on in, say, responses to the Holocaust or responses to serial killers, where you've got a whole lot of secular thinkers using the concept of evil to condemn what's happened.
Right, but is the goal here then to arrive at an objective explanation of evil or an objective understanding of it that does not depend on the particular cultural setting we're in?
So I think in this domain, we're trying to be as objective as we can be, but at the same time, our target in this domain is to some extent fixed by the language use of people who are, speaking English and who are engaged in discussions about whether anything really is evil or not, right? So it's a very interesting question whether in non-English speaking cultures there is a concept with a label that matches up neatly to what's going on, in the English speaking world in relation to discussion of evil. Now, this is a broad question. You can ask that question in relation to evil, but you can ask this question in relation to all of the interesting moral concepts that we think about, say, duty, obligation. Another topic that I've done a lot of work on is forgiveness. And they're fascinating questions about whether what what me and my friends mean when we're using the word forgiveness matches up to what people who have a different culture and using a different language are talking about. So those translation issues are always going to be very interesting. So in the scientific domain, often we can use techniques to latch on to one and the same topic, even if we're using different languages. We can put something in a test tube and say, this is the substance we are investigating. We all agree that whatever's in this test tube, this is what we want to find out about. It's harder to do that when you're thinking about things in the domain of morality, right? You are sometimes going to be able to point to examples to try and get common ground and solve some translation issues between different languages. So we can use that kind of trick in relation to evil as well. We can say, right, let's look at this particular, for example, terrorist atrocity, or let's look at this genocide, or let's look at this particular serial killer. Then we ask, okay, what categories have you got for evaluating that kind of action and that kind of person? Try and figure out the contours of those categories or concepts and see if they match up to what we mean when we're talking about evil. So these are, I think, really hard and interesting questions. And as philosophers doing moral philosophy, we've got a tougher job in relation to that issue compared to, say, scientists who are investigating the physical world and trying to translate between different languages.
Yeah. Are depictions of evil in fiction useful for thinking about it, or do you think they are usually exaggerated or something else?
That's a fascinating question. So there are lots of fictional portrayals of evil, and often they shape people's thinking about evil.
Yeah.
Now, we get this if we're just focused on Western culture, you get depictions of Satan in literature. You get depiction of Satan in the Bible as a potentially evil figure. One of the influential ones in the English-speaking tradition is Milton's poem Paradise Lost, which features Satan as the protagonist in this poem. And you've got a very detailed, fleshed out depiction of a character who is self-consciously evil in that poem. Now, does that show, okay, this is what evil is supposed to be? If someone is evil, then they must be like Satan as described by Milton. I think this is a dangerous technique to pick a literary example, especially an old literary example like Milton's poem, and say, this tells us what evil is supposed to be. Because, as we've seen already, the meaning of the word evil has shifted dramatically over time. And in 20th century and 21st century discussions of evil, it clearly has connotations of extremity, whereas in earlier discussions, it doesn't. Evil's just used as a synonym for bad. So I think we've got to be careful about using fictional portrayals. They are, I think, one kind of source of information, one source of data about what evil perhaps is supposed to be. But I think they're much less significant than real life moral evaluations. For example, discussions in response to the Holocaust or discussions of the genocide in Rwanda. Right? These are real life examples where there's no exaggeration going on. We're dealing with genuine atrocity. Right? And I think what people say in relation to evil in light of those examples and in response to those examples is probably a better guide than the fictional depictions of evil. Mm-hmm. So if I can elaborate on that for a minute, some fictional depictions of evil present evildoers as sadistic, so as taking intense pleasure in inflicting suffering on other people. And they depict evildoers as defiant, as doing what they themselves know to be evil, acting in a way that they know is immoral, and doing it perhaps because it's immoral or despite of the fact that it's immoral. So this is the kind of depiction of evil that you get in lots of contemporary fiction. You can think about a TV show like The Simpsons. The character of Mr. Burns in The Simpsons is presented as evil sometimes, right? And cinematic convention is used to help the audience know, oh, okay, Dr. Burns is being evil, right? He's lit from below, he's rubbing his hands together, and he's laughing in contemplation of the harm that he's about to do to other people. So that's a kind of stereotypical depiction of a sadistic and defiant evildoer. And there are others as well. Dr. Evil in the Austin Powers films, The Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz, right? So this is a kind of familiar fictional trope. And some of the philosophers who've written about evil in the 20th century think that we get a kind of misleading picture of evil if we focus on those fictional examples. So Hannah Arendt is a fascinating example of this. Hannah Arendt wrote a lot in response to the Holocaust, trying to make sense of what had happened. And initially, her first response to the Holocaust was to say the Holocaust has revealed a radical evil that has not been present in the world before now. So she thought the kind of wrongdoing, the scale of wrongdoing, and the kind of industrialization of murder was a radically new kind of evil. And she suggested that it could not be explained by ordinary motives. But then, years later, Arendt attended some of the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi war criminal, who was captured in Argentina and taken to Jerusalem and put on trial for war crimes. And Arendt describes going to this trial and expecting to see a monster. That's her terminology. She expects to see a monster. She expects to see someone who is acting out of malice, acting out of hatred towards his victims, who is taking sadistic pleasure in the wrong that he inflicts, and who knows that what he's doing is wrong and is trying to be evil self-consciously. Now, when Arendt watched Eichmann in that trial, she said she was shocked to see someone who didn't have those characteristics, who was not a stereotypical villain, in her words, but nonetheless someone who perpetrated the most horrendous evils. Right? So this led Arendt to say, it's a mistake to focus on those fictional examples and stereotypical evildoers. Arendt thinks that the trial of Eichmann revealed the banality of evil. Now that's a very famous and influential phrase, but it's hard to understand. Right? So by the banality of evil, Arendt means that evil actions can be performed out of ordinary motives by psychologically ordinary people. She's not trying to suggest that evil is unremarkable or nothing to be concerned about. Right? She's instead trying to say evil can be perpetrated by ordinary people who are similar to you and me. Right? So that model, the banality of evil, that way of thinking about evil has been very influential. And some of the more contemporary philosophers, like Claudia Card and Paul Formosa, who've written about evil, are very influenced by Arendt on that point. And they agree with her. They think it's a mistake to suppose that every evildoer is like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. Right? They think some evildoers are doing horrendously wrong things just because they're trying to do their jobs. Perhaps Arendt suggests because they're not thinking clearly about the consequences of their actions. Right? And sometimes people perform horrible wrongs not out of malice towards their victims, but because they think this is their duty. They mistakenly believe their duty is to eliminate these people to whom they don't bear significant ill will. Okay, so that's an explanation of the kind of relationship between fictional depictions of evil and the real world. But there's one more thing I just have to say on this, Ricardo. It's very important. Arendt's description of the banality of evil has been hugely influential. But it's very clear from subsequent historical work that Arendt's description of Eichmann himself was inaccurate. So Arendt was fooled by Eichmann in the trial. Eichmann was acting dumb. Eichmann was pretending he was just following orders. He had borne no animosity towards the Jews. Right? He was thoughtlessly going on with his job. Right? David Cesarani's book, The Portrait of a Desk Murderer, and some other more recent work provides really, I think, very conclusive evidence that that's not what Eichmann's psychology was actually like. Eichmann was motivated by intense malice towards his victims. right? And he's not a kind of bumbling fool trying to impress his boss, right? So I think we've got to be careful when we're describing Arendt's philosophy of evil to point out that she got Eichmann wrong. But a lot of philosophers think she was wrong about Eichmann himself, but she wasn't wrong about the possibility of banal evildoing. So a lot of philosophers agree with her that some perpetrators of incredibly wrong actions are not like fictional villains. They're not rubbing their hands together contemplating the suffering of their victims, right? They're doing things that they mistakenly believe to be justified, and sometimes they're not thinking clearly about the consequences of their actions. So there are philosophers who think Arendt was wrong about Eichmann, but right about the possibility that some evil actions are banal.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, with all of that in mind, do you think that we could say that evil is something that all people can perpetrate, or that only certain people can do because of perhaps some of their psychological traits?
I think this is a difficult question. We can point to examples of people who've done horrendously wrong things who do seem psychologically very different to you and I. Right? If you read about serial killers and the things that they do and the things that they enjoy, the things that they plan out and seek out, right? I hope you would agree with me that they seem pretty different to us.
Yeah.
But not all extreme wrongs are perpetrated by people like that, right? So there are a very influential set of experiments carried out from the 1960s onwards by social psychologists, especially Stanley Milgram, which suggests that ordinary people can be made to do horrendously wrong things if they're placed in a social environment where there's an authority figure who's telling them what to do and no one is contradicting that authority figure. And I'd say Milgram's famous obedience experiment, which has been replicated many times over in many different cultures with different groups of people, suggests that we ordinary people are badly susceptible to authority figures. And there's a very interesting question as to whether you want to say someone who is being pushed by an authority figure to, say, torture someone else is guilty of performing an evil action. I think there's room for disagreement on this. Some people will want to say, no, it's the authority figure who is morally responsible for what's happening here. And the person who is, pressing the button or who's, administering the electric shocks to the innocent victim is not actually guilty of wrongdoing. Some people might hold that view. But a lot of us think that you are culpable for the things that you do, even when an authority figure is telling you to do them. This might be different if the authority figure is threatening you or coercing you. But if they're just telling you to do it and you fall into line, it seems like a pretty bad moral error that you've made. And it's an error for which it seems you're morally responsible. So if it's true that ordinary people, when placed under an authority figure, tend to be very easily manipulated, easily pushed into doing things, even things that conflict with their own values, right, then I think it's pretty plausible that ordinary people are capable of doing evil. I don't think ordinary people seek out evil actions, but I think ordinary people can be pushed into doing evil.
Right. And do you think that at least sometimes evil acts might have moral motivations behind them? I'm asking you that because, if we consider acts that are not really that extreme, sometimes people, when they're trying to justify their actions, they're saying something like they're seeking justice. They have been wronged in some way, and that's their motivation. But would that apply to evil acts, or are they so extreme that they're going beyond that kind of motivation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think there's an ambiguity in discussion of moral motivation. So one thing you might mean by moral motivation is the person who's performing the action believes, rightly or wrongly, that what they're doing is morally right.
Right.
That's one thing you might call moral motivation. But of course, people can be deeply, deeply misguided in their moral worldview. And it's true that lots of, say, perpetrators of terrorist atrocities, like Anders Behring Breivik, right, in Norway, who shot, more than 60 innocent teenagers, right, in a kind of terrorist act of spree killing. Breivik thought that what he was doing was completely justified. So on one meaning of moral motivation, Breivik had a moral motivation.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, he mistakenly believed that what he was doing was morally right. Now, this is true of lots of war criminals. Lots of war criminals who are ideologically motivated mistakenly believe that they are on the side of justice. So if that's what you mean by moral motivation, then I think, yeah, evil actions can have moral motivations. But a different thing that you might mean by moral motivation is a motivation that's genuinely morally good. And here I think we're in trickier territory. Sometimes people do the wrong thing out of a genuinely good motive. For example, so some parents who mistakenly believe that vaccinating their children will give their children autism act out of concern for the well-being of their children, and they prevent their children from being vaccinated. Now, I think that's actually the wrong action. It's not an action that's going to promote the health and well-being of their children. But I'm willing to say those parents are acting out of at least one good motive, right, which is concern for the well-being of their children. So can there be evil actions that have that kind of, a good motive behind them? I think I'd have to think about this in a bit more detail. I think that probably is possible if that morally good motive is combined with some other, really badly mistaken beliefs, and perhaps combined with some other really bad moral motives.
Mm-hmm. So in classifying something as an evil act, should we take into account people's intentions?
Yeah, good question. So there are some philosophers who think that's really the heart of the distinction between evil actions and ordinary wrongs, non-evil actions, right? So they think that evil actions have got a distinctive kind of motive or intention that lies behind them. So there are philosophers who've defended this view. There are philosophers who think that the distinctive feature of evil actions is that they are motivated by malice, and that the perpetrator of an evil action intends and desires to inflict harm on the victim for its own sake, not just as a means to securing some other end. For instance, not just as a way to try and get rich. Right? They want to harm that person, and that's the end that they're pursuing. They want that person to suffer. Right, so there are philosophers who think that the motive is crucially important in relation to an action counting as evil. Now, I think there are some strong arguments against that kind of view. And these arguments will take the form of finding examples of actions that are extremely wrong, that strike us as worthy of the strongest moral condemnation, that are not performed out of malice. Right? And some of the examples that I was talking about before in relation to Arendt potentially fit into this category. Right? So you might have some people who mistakenly believe that, in order to secure this really important goal, they need to eliminate people who stand in the way of that goal. And they might bear no malice towards the people who they're killing. They might think, this is just inconvenient. I wish you weren't here because then I wouldn't have to kill you. Now, this is a chilling kind of psychology, but notice the perpetrator of that kind of murder is not being motivated by malice towards the victims. Now, if you think that kind of killing, say on a large scale, is morally extreme enough to count as evil, then I think you're going to go with Arendt. You're going to say, there's not a distinctive motive that lies behind evil actions. Evil actions can come from a really broad range of motives. It's not the case that all evildoers are psychologically similar to each other in that they're pursuing the same kind of goal.
Yeah, and so should we also consider people's reactions to particular acts? I mean, if they think that they are evil, or if they think that actions wronged people in some particularly extreme ways, should we consider that?
Sorry, can you just ask that question again? I got a bit lost in that question.
Oh, okay. So I was asking if we should also consider people's reactions to evil.
Good. Okay. Yeah. So there are philosophers who think that the concept of evil is distinguished from ordinary wrongdoing because when we use the language of evil, we're trying to express a particular kind of reaction. So they think something, roughly speaking, like this. They think when you call something evil, you're expressing horror or you're expressing a kind of moral disgust.
Right.
And there are concepts that are like this, that are expressive concepts. Right? So disgust is one example. Right? When you call something disgusting, you're expressing a reaction to it. So this is an interesting possibility for trying to come up with a philosophical account of evil. You might think evil is different from ordinary wrongdoing in that it is horrific wrongdoing. So the philosopher Steve Dissenter, for example, has defended this kind of view about the concept of evil. And Dissenter thinks, evil's an important concept because we need to be able to express that kind of horror. I think that this is not the most fruitful way of characterizing evil, even though I agree with Dissenter that evil actions should provoke horror in us. They should produce a reaction of horror. Right? Where I disagree with Dissenter on this is whether that really is the hallmark of evil action, or rather whether we should think of evils as extreme wrongs that are so wrong that a morally well-attuned observer would be horrified if they witness it. So I think the direction of explanation here should go from the extremity of wrongness justifying a response of horror, rather than saying, well, if we're horrified by something, then that makes it evil. The horror response constitutes, or if you like, the horror response sets the boundaries of the category. Okay, so for example, one way I would argue against that very tight link between a horror response and evil would be to point out that some people might become jaded in their responses. Their emotional horror that they experience when they first encounter unjustified killing, for example, in a war setting, might be worn down through repetition. And it might be the case that after years of witnessing these kind of wrongs, they can no longer muster that emotional response, that feeling of horror. And nonetheless, I think they might still be able to judge that what they're witnessing is evil. It's worthy of horror. They can't, if you like, summon the energy to be horrified anymore, but they still judge that what they're witnessing is so morally extreme that it's worthy of horror. So I think there is a connection between reactions and evil, but I think the explanatory direction should be the moral extremity of the action explains which reactions are justified in observers.
Right. Do you think that we can talk about some sort of sex difference when it comes to performing evil acts? Because when we look into cases where people went really extreme, it seems that most of them are committed by men.
I agree with what you've said there. I think most evil actions are committed by men. Now, I certainly don't want to sign up for the view that only men can do evil or that only men can be evil people. There are examples of female serial killers who've done horrendously wrong things again and again. But if you look at the averages, right, it's the much bigger proportion of serial killers, of torturers in a war setting, right, of ideologically motivated terrorists. The bigger proportion of those are male. Now, this is something where you'd have to have research done by psychologists, potentially even biologists, in relation to the explanation for why there is that split. You'll have interesting disagreements between, I think, some people who would say that difference in proportion is due to nurture and cultural differences and upbringing. And I think there'll be a strong argument from the opposing camp who'll say that a big proportion of that difference is, if you like, a biological difference between levels of aggression in men and women. Now, that's a very hot debate in psychology and biology. That's not my area of expertise. And I'm going to leave the explanations of those differences to other people.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so I mean, some people say that evil acts are incomprehensible, at least to the vast majority of people, the common people, let's say. Of course, that would get us again into the question of if evil is banal or not. But do you think that that criterion should be taken into account, that evil acts are somewhat incomprehensible to most people?
This is a commonly reported reaction to evil. And as you say, there are some philosophers who think that this is a good way to distinguish evil from ordinary wrongdoing. You might think ordinary wrongs are comprehensible in that we can somehow make sense of them. We can perhaps see why the person did that wrong thing. And another potential meaning of comprehensibility, perhaps we can imagine ourselves doing that kind of thing in some circumstances. You might think, that action is comprehensible to me in the sense that, oh yeah, I can see how someone like me might do that. And there are a lot of people who say they find evil actions, so things like, say, a suicide bombing, right, or torture being committed on military captives. They look at that and they think, I don't understand how anyone could do that or why they would do it. So they think potentially that kind of incomprehension could be the hallmark of evil. It could allow us to distinguish evils from ordinary wrongs. Now, I'm not a fan of that view. I think that's a mistaken way to try and draw the distinction. And here are some arguments for why I think that. So there are some examples where we get a very clear and detailed explanation of why the person performed this horribly wrong action. Now, a lot of terrorists do this for us. They write a manifesto. They lay out in a whole lot of detail why they're performing this thing, what political goals or what moral goals they're trying to achieve, which grievances they have that they're trying to redress through this action. So we can get a whole lot of psychological explanation of what the person was trying to do and why they were doing it. And my argument would be, it's not the case that when we see why they did it, when the action becomes comprehensible in that sense, that we suddenly judge, oh, that wasn't evil. Right? It's not that when we read why Breivik did what he did, why he was, walking around that island with a machine gun shooting innocent teenagers. It's not the case that when we read his political manifesto, we say, oh, I thought what he did was evil, but now I see why he was doing it, so I don't think it's evil anymore. Right? Often the motives that people have and the rationale behind their action is, just as horrific as the action itself. And it doesn't count as any kind of mitigation. It doesn't soften our moral condemnation. So I don't think that the category of evil is closely aligned with the category of the incomprehensible in that sense. There's a different meaning of incomprehensible, which I referred to earlier, which is you might say something is incomprehensible in the sense that you couldn't imagine yourself doing it or freely choosing to do it. I think it's more plausible that evil actions are incomprehensible in that sense, but we have to ask, incomprehensible to whom? Because remember, evil actions, what I would describe as evil actions, like what Breivik did in that terrorist mass killing, evil actions are certainly things that the perpetrators of those actions can imagine doing, right? He planned out that action meticulously. He knew what he was doing. He pictured himself doing it, and then he did it. And now, the fact that it was a comprehensible action to him, I think, does not mean that it's not evil. Right? So I want to break that connection that some people have suggested between comprehensibility and evil. And just one more style of argument in favor of that. There are some serial killers who self-consciously describe themselves as evil. Right? They know that what they're doing is morally wrong. They're not similar to people like Breivik, who have a kind of self-righteous but misguided cause. They're just people who knowingly want to do the most horrifically wrong things. They, for instance, want to torture and murder their victims while knowing that that's morally wrong. And some of them self-describe as evil. They know that what they're doing is evil, and yet their actions are perfectly comprehensible to themselves. Right? So that's another argument for suggesting there is not an alignment between the evil and the incomprehensible. There are actions that are evil and that are perfectly comprehensible, even though they ought to provoke a response of horror in us.
Mm-hmm. So with all of that in mind, and since we've been talking about different criteria to classify an action as evil or not, would you have a definite set of criteria of your own to say that a specific act is evil?
Yeah, so I'm influenced by Arendt to some extent. I think Arendt is right that evil actions can come from a very broad range of motives. So I think the best kind of account that we can give of evil action is to say that evils are the most morally extreme wrongs. And then I think we need to get into some more fine-grained detail to explain the kind of extremity. So I would say they're wrong actions that either inflict an extreme amount of harm on at least one victim, but potentially many victims, or they're actions that foreseeably would inflict that extreme amount of harm were they successful. So what I'm trying to do there is suggest that many evil actions are extremely harmful. And if we think of, say, terrorist suicide bombings, if we think of genocide in war, right, if we think of what serial killers do, they are actions that are extremely harmful. They inflict a massive amount of harm. But I'm suggesting that there can be some evil actions that are harmless or not very harmful at all. Right, so I think the clearest example of this will be failed attempts to do those other things. So a classic example of this is Richard Reed, the so-called shoe bomber, who tried to blow up a transatlantic flight. He had a bomb in his shoe, and as the plane was over the Atlantic, he tried to light the bomb, but thankfully the fuse was wet because it had been raining that day. He couldn't light the bomb. People intervened. The plane was not blown up. Everyone survived. So that's a comparatively harmless action. It's very lucky that it turned out to be harmless, right? But I want to say that kind of action deserves our strongest moral condemnation. I want to put that in the same category, morally speaking, as the successful attempts at suicide bombing, right? So that's why I think evil actions are ones that are either extremely harmful, where the perpetrator is morally responsible for that harm in its extremity, or the actions that would have been extremely harmful if they had been successful.
Mm-hmm. So just another 2 or 3 questions now, talking about other aspects of evilness. So do you think that evil people are born that way?
This is a very tough question. Is it the case that if someone's an evil person, they must be born evil? Now, so far, I haven't given you an explanation of what I think an evil person is. I've mentioned that there are cases where people say that a person is evil, but mainly I've been talking about evil actions and evildoers. An evildoer is someone who does an evil thing. Okay, but the category of evil person, I think, is really interesting and is much more contentious than the category of evil action. So I think what's going on when you look at the way that people talk about evil and when you look at the way that lots of philosophers have written about evil, is there is some kind of step up involved in moving between an evildoer and an evil person. So a very common phrase amongst philosophers who write about evil is that not every evildoer is an evil person. And you might try and find some examples. You might look at cases of people who've been, perhaps through no fault of their own, placed in difficult circumstances, and they've been pressured in a certain way and they've done a horrendously wrong thing. But it's not the kind of thing that they would have sought out on their own. You might think you are responsible for having done that. What you did was terribly wrong. But you're nowhere near as morally bad as, say, a serial killer who seeks out opportunities to do this kind of thing, right? And here's another aspect, I think, of an important aspect of the concept of evil person. I think if you look at the way that judgment is used often in political discussions or in relation to, say, terrorists, the implication of someone being an evil person is that we can't fix that person. We ought to treat that person as a write-off. It would be silly and foolish for us to try and negotiate with that person and hold out hope that they might undergo reform. We should just write them off. We should, for example, lock them up forever. People who believe in the death penalty might say we should just kill someone if they're an evil person because they can't be fixed. Now, here is, I think, a really interesting explanation of why some people are very happy to judge that particular actions are evil, but they're very reluctant to judge that any person is an evil person. And that's because they think that even when someone has performed a horrendous moral wrong, an extreme moral wrong, we should still hold out hope that we could reform that person. Well, that person might, see the error of his ways and come to be a morally good person. So I think that's what's going on in the judgment that someone's an evil person. You're thinking they're someone who will seek out the opportunity to do evil. They're strongly disposed to do the most horrendously wrong things, and they're beyond our reach in the sense that we can't fix them and we shouldn't expect them to change their ways. Now, if that's true, I think we ought to be very cautious in judging that anyone is an evil person, even if we know that person has done a horrendously wrong thing. I think the more justified and the more morally defensible attitude in most of those cases would be to say, let's condemn the wrong action in the strongest terms. Let's hold the person responsible for having done that, but let's hold out hope that we could help that person to undergo moral reform. All right, so that's what I think is the distinction between an evildoer and an evil person. Now, I do believe that some people are evil. I think some people have given us pretty clear evidence that not only are they strongly disposed to perform the morally worst kind of wrong actions, but they're also beyond reform. I think some ideologically committed war criminals have given us pretty clear evidence that they are not going to change their ways. I think some serial killers like Ted Bundy, who was on a killing spree, a serial killer, abducting, torturing, and murdering young women, right, who was then locked up, imprisoned, and then escaped from prison, and within a month, he was killing again. Right, this is someone who was subsequently caught and convicted, but who never showed any remorse for what he did. Now, it is possible, I concede, it is possible that someone like Ted Bundy could perhaps undergo moral reform. But I think he's given us really strong evidence that he's beyond reform. And that's why I would be comfortable judging him to be not just an evildoer, but an evil person. Now, I want to be really clear. I think that is not the case for most of the people who we know to have done horrendously wrong things. For most of them, we haven't got clear evidence as to whether they can be reformed or not. And so I think we ought to be cautiously optimistic in most of those cases.
Mm-hmm. So one last question regarding those people that we think can be reformed. Do you have any solutions for them? I mean, how should we approach them in order to try to make them avoid more evil actions?
I think this is going to depend a lot on which particular person we're talking to, what motivated that person, and what other things that person cares about. So, as I've said, I I'm on the side of this philosophical debate that suggests that evildoers have quite varied motives. And I think some people who perform horrendously wrong actions are not strongly disposed to do that kind of thing again. They did it because they are in a very difficult circumstance. And yes, it's valuable for all of us to try and build a moral character which would resist, for example, being pushed by an authority figure to do something that's terribly wrong. Right, but someone who performs a horrendously wrong action in those circumstances is not that different from the rest of us. And you might be able to, get that person to avoid doing that kind of thing in future without much psychological intervention at all. Not every evildoer is like that. Some people perform horrendously morally wrong actions out of their own volition, if you like. They seek out the opportunity to do it. Sometimes people perform horrendously wrong actions out of strong surges of emotion. Right? For instance, they get incredibly angry and they fly off the handle. Right? There are some people who perform horrendously wrong actions because they're incredibly greedy. And they think, I know how I can get rich quick. It's to kill this person and take this person's money. So I just think there is a very wide range of motives that lie behind terribly wrong actions. And so there's not going to be an easy rule book to follow if you're thinking, how can we help this person reform? Because, they have different motives. They're going to be, I think, susceptible to different kinds of treatment. One of the things that seems to be true of people in relation to violent crime in general, so this is not a category that's equivalent to evil action, but violent crime in general is people tend to be more likely to do it when they're in their late teens than in their 20s, and then the tendency towards violence eases off for most people, not for everyone. Right? So we may have cautious hope that some people who are strongly disposed to perform, violent assaults when they're young, they might grow out of it. They might get to an age where they're no longer inclined to do that kind of thing. Of course, we try and intervene in lots of ways. We use different modes of moral education. We do things like encourage people to go to anger management classes. We encourage people to try and develop their empathy or compassion for other people. We try and get people to develop their skills in imagining what it's like to be a victim. So these are all techniques that could be used. I'm not a psychologist. It's very easy to tell stories about which of those are going to be effective for which people. I think you need to do empirical research there. And my prediction is going to be different things will be effective for different people because their motives are so varied. And we might discover that some things that, strike us as seeming like they would be really good ways to morally reform people might in fact not have much of an impact at all. So, for example, I read fiction. I like reading novels. I think it's a lovely thing to do. There are quite a few philosophers who think that reading novels will make you a morally much better person because it will develop your ability to empathize with other people who live lives very different from you. It'll help you take the perspective of other people, and that can only encourage you to not inflict extreme suffering on others. Now, that's a lovely narrative. That's a lovely story. Is it true? We can't tell whether that's true by just, sitting back in our armchairs and saying, I think fiction morally reforms people. Right? You'd have to carry out carefully constructed experiments to figure out whether that's actually true. Now, I am a philosopher. I've never had to actually deal with the task of trying to help people who performed incredibly wrong actions to see the error of their ways and, undergo moral reform. This is something that people have to do, say social workers, counsellors who are working in prisons, for example. It's incredibly interesting, I'm sure very difficult work. And it's a kind of task where, I can sit back and reflect on it, but I haven't got first-hand expertise in doing that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's end on that note. The book is Again Being Evil, a philosophical perspective. Where can people find you on the internet?
So people can find me at the University of Sydney, and you'll be able to contact me through the University of Sydney. The book is published by Oxford University Press. It's available online. It's available by all the big online booksellers, and it's available in bookshops that stock academic titles by Oxford University Press. I should say this is a book that is written for a kind of general public audience. So this is a book where I've tried to avoid, obviously I haven't completely succeeded in avoiding some of the technical terminology that philosophers use, but this is intended to be a more accessible discussion of these philosophical debates that can become very complicated and alienating. And one of the great things about this topic is people tend to have strong reactions to it. And there are lots of examples. Now, it's also a terrible thing that there are lots of examples of the most morally extreme wrongs. But this is something that we need to grapple with if we're thinking about the nature of morality. We need to not just focus on acts of kindness and generosity we can do to each other. If we want to figure out how morality works, what moral judgments are, and which moral judgments we ought to be making, we need to unfortunately think about some of the awful things as well. And if you are interested in how we ought to respond to things like terrorist attacks or serial killing or torture carried out in the military, or perhaps you're interested in other kinds of extreme wrongs, potentially things like, political policies that have disastrous effects for enormous numbers of people, right, then this is, I think, a really interesting discussion where there'll be lots of examples that you can connect with, that you'll be familiar with, and you can use those examples to help you navigate the different philosophical theories of evil.
Mm-hmm. Very well. Okay, so Dr. Russel, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
You're welcome. Thanks for your questions. They're really good, insightful questions. I've enjoyed the discussion.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. So it is thanks to people like you that the show has been running for such a long time, more than 3 years now. And I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, you can also find links to it in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, hit the subscription button, and comment on it. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whiting, Bernardo Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Bosch, Bo Weingart, Becca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windecker, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, George Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Ala Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.